Thank you for joining us today for this special presentation. This year marks the 75th anniversary of the dropping of the atomic bombs that ended World War II. Local historian Doug Haar has recorded a special presentation that explains President Truman's actions and choices that helped make his decisions about dropping the atomic bombs and presents little-known facts and evidence. I hope you find this presentation as fascinating as I did. So sit back and watch the presentation, Traditionalists and Revisionists, the End of World War II in the Pacific, 75 years ago.
Hello, we're here today to talk about the 75th anniversary of the end of the war in the Pacific and the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I've been teaching this for, I guess, going on 31, 32 years, and one of the things I'll have to start out by saying right away is I'm somewhat biased in regards to this. Years ago, while taking a historiography class at the undergraduate level, not at the graduate level, I didn't talk about this there, but in the undergrad class, we had a discussion on one particular week about whether or not Truman should have, used the bomb or gone through with the invasion. Well, first off, you have to understand there are some issues here in regards to that today. If you open up some of the sites online, and right away it'll have, is the U.S. Are we changing our mind in regards to the atomic bomb? Be careful. You have to understand there's a context to these things, and I think a lot of times the context is overlooked. And getting back to my bias and the historiography class, I am biased because my father would have been in the invasion. He would have been in the first wave of the invasion. And I don't believe that he would have survived. Having studied this for quite some time, the odds are very slim that he would have survived. And as I get through this, you'll understand. So Truman, interestingly enough, felt he had to drop the bomb. And his grandson reiterated that this week, once again, in the interviews that he did. So we'll take a look at things. And one of the things I want to also point out is that we've had some revisionists. Okay, there are two views. There's a traditionalist view and there's a revisionist view. And sometimes I think some of the historians refer to the revisionists as critics because they don't really look at them as being full-fledged historians sometimes because they cherry-pick the data, okay, or the information. Okay, from what we know, though, there's some issues here, too, with the data. For instance, the president today, President Trump, gets the presidential daily briefing every day. And when they had presidential briefings at this time, they tried to keep things as secret as possible. So any notes that were kept by any of the particulars or any of the main players, anybody for that matter, those notes were confiscated, including the notes of the President of the United States. So those notes were destroyed. That's the same day. Okay, so it was very, very fascinating. One of the things, though, that helps us with this, that came out, and that was in late 1970s, 78, 79, they announced that they had the ultra wire codes. In other words, ultra would be the code name for the intercepts that Bletchley Park actually broke the Enigma code, and we're reading the German intercepts, at least the British were. And Churchill referred to it as his ultra secret, so they used the word ultra to describe that. And they kept it secret throughout the war. The fact is that sometimes Montgomery was getting Rommel's battle plans before Rommel even had them deciphered, if you will, okay? Or I don't think that's the right word. They had to decipher, that's correct. Anyway, Churchill had a really tough time whether or not he's going to share that with Roosevelt once the United States got involved in conflict. Ultimately, he did. The terminology that we use for breaking the Japanese code would be purple or magic. Okay. Anyway, interestingly, and it's rather ironic that the ultra intercepts, that the breaking of the Enigma code, actually helped us out here because the Japanese ambassador to Berlin actually talked quite a bit, and so those intercepts then translated over to the Pacific Theater. Okay. But we found out, and this is what happened with the revisionists, is that the revisionists actually took some of that information and cherry-picked it, stating that Japan was ready to surrender and that we didn't need to use the atomic bomb. And I would offer a premise that that's incorrect. They were not ready to surrender. In fact, a little known fact would be that the very time when the emperor broke the deadlock and ultimately decided to go by the Potsdam Declaration, he didn't use the word surrender, he actually broke the deadlock with his advisors. And there was a group of military advisors that had held power for quite some time, didn't want that. They wanted to fight the Ketsugo, or the final battle. And that way they would allow for some arbitration, some negotiation, and they could get away from the unconditional surrender aspect of the, first of all, was the Casablanca Conference and then the Potsdam Declaration. However, that palace coup was then an attempt to overthrow the emperor and not surrender. And I don't think very many people understand that actually took place. So once again, that's some evidence that's offered up that sort of goes against what the revisionists were offering, or the critics were offering. The information that the critics were offering, and where they got the information from, was an ambassador or a diplomat, a Japanese diplomat, that actually didn't have the power to make any decisions for Japan. So there was an undercurrent within Japan, of course there was, that felt that the war was useless and that they needed to get out of it as quickly as possible, but they didn't have any power. They had no way of bringing that about. The powers that be, and in fact the general public, were ready to fight to the end. So here we go. With the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II in the Pacific, the traditionalist view is the view that Truman dropped the bomb to end the war as quickly as possible and save American lives. And ironically, not only did he save American lives, but he also saved lives of people in Southeast Asia, including the Japanese. Okay, the revisionist view, this once again started in the 1960s. Once again, they cherry-picked their data. And one of the things that I really want you to understand is that the context of the times is very, very important. Very, very important. And one of the things I want to point out there is that there's somewhat of a bias in regards to how we viewed the Japanese and how the Japanese viewed us. The Japanese viewed the Americans as being slothful, lazy, spoiled, lacking a spiritual sense, and we looked at the Japanese as being inferior, that they had poor eyesight, etc. Okay, so there was definitely discrimination and bias in regards to those things. But you also have to understand the context of the times in regards to the mentality of the people and the Japanese soldiers' mentality when it came to fighting. And the people that were in charge and had this ultra-nationalist view, seeking an empire, and also the natural resources that went along with that empire and the benefits of that empire, didn't want to give that up, nor did they want to give up power within the government, the power that they had. Okay. All right, so the commanders here, some of the people involved here. General MacArthur was actually retired in 1934 and was brought back out of retirement in 1940 and sent to the Philippines. Okay, and ultimately he was a critic of the war plans that existed at that time. War Plan Orange and Dog, etc. They modified those. Ultimately, the idea was that we were going to make our stand in the Philippines, and if the Japanese invaded, there's nothing we could do to stop them, that we would simply allow them to invade, and we would send the resources to the United States as quickly as possible and push them out and take the war to Japan. Okay. Ultimately, MacArthur was pushed out of the Philippines and made that famous promise, "I shall return," and 2 years later he actually did. And he was in command originally in the Southern Pacific. Chester Nimitz was the naval admiral that replaced the U.S. admiral after Pearl Harbor. He was in command of the Northern Pacific, and ultimately those two were going to butt heads from time to time. For the most part, got along okay. All right? So the concept in defeating the Japanese in the Pacific was going to be island hopping. Okay, so once again, the Japanese attacked us in Pearl Harbor. And one of the major, I guess, issues here with this whole thing leading up to the atomic bomb is that the Japanese totally underestimated the impact that Pearl Harbor had in the American psyche, that Pearl Harbor had in the American people, for that matter. Okay, that sneak attack. And I could go on for a while here and mention some other things. The fact that they were going to declare war before they actually bombed Pearl Harbor, but that didn't quite work out. Okay, so it galvanized, a rallying event that galvanized Americans against them. And it was supposed to be, according to the war studies that took place prior to that, was that if we had a war and it became very obvious that we were going to be fighting against Germany, Italy, and Japan, and once we got into the war, the war planners, the powers that be within the War Department, decided that it should be Germany first. And Adolf Hitler and the Nazis posed the bigger threat, and that we needed to defeat them first. But Japan attacked us at Pearl Harbor, right? So there's this guy by the name of Admiral King, and Admiral King is a force to be reckoned with within the Naval Department, and he saw to it that the forces in the Pacific Theater were maintained, and that we had an adequate presence there to take it to the Japanese. And what a lot of people don't realize is that the U.S. Marines fought primarily in the Pacific, not in the European theater. That was U.S. Army and U.S. Army Air Force and the U.S. Navy to a degree, but U.S. Marines fought primarily in the Pacific theater, and they were also, once again, under the command, in some cases, under MacArthur, as well as the U.S. Naval forces were under MacArthur. They're in the Southern Pacific, and once again, Northern Pacific, they're in Nimitz. That was going to change up here towards the end of the war, but we're not going to get that here. Okay, so we're going to island hop. In other words, there were thousands of islands, and we were going to take the most important ones and bypass certain islands because they would be left without any logistical support. Rabaul was one of those, which is northwest of New Guinea. Okay, so we started the Guadalcanal campaign, fought the battle at Coral Sea, stopped the invasion of Australia, and then we start island hopping. Okay, but the Japanese fought with a tenacity unlike any enemy we've ever fought before, at least in the 20th century. Okay. And I guess E.B. Sledge's book is probably a pretty good read if you want to get an idea what island fighting was like, and it's with the Old Breed by E.B. Sledge. And that gives you an idea of the tenacity of the fighting that took place with the amphibious landing. And he starts out after Peleliu, I believe, and goes forward to Okinawa, and he's just an 18-year-old kid. And it's a very interesting read. I know, having talked to veterans my entire life, growing up with veterans, it was a different element, right? During the day, temperatures got up in 120 sometimes. It was nasty, nasty hot. And the Japanese didn't treat the wounded very well, and they didn't believe in surrender. It was part of the Bushido Code, okay, the samurai code, the Bushido Code. There wasn't the word surrender wasn't recognized. It was a total dishonor if you did something like that. The Japanese rifle had a chrysanthemum on it, and that chrysanthemum was the emperor's seal, and you wouldn't let anything with the emperor's seal fall into enemy hands. They believed the emperor was a god. My father was on occupation duty. When the emperor's car came around the corner, the people in Japan all became prostrate just like that. It's a fascinating concept, if you will. But as we proceeded to get closer to the home islands, the tenacity of the Japanese soldier became even more fierce, and they weren't willing to surrender. They would fight to the death. And as we get closer, the casualties mount, and the casualty counts are higher than what they were in the European theater. Okay, now the Nazis, awful. World War II, any war is bad, don't get me wrong, but we don't want to get understanding why Truman chose to do what he did. So you have to understand that fighting in this particular era was god awful. Okay, all right. So Tarawa was November 1943. We had an amphibious landing there years ago. Ken Hensler, who was the high school principal here in Yankton, was actually a medic aboard an amphibious assault ship, and he described that to Mr. Hosmer and I in great detail. Unfortunately, Mr. Hensler's not with us any longer, but we had a lot of Yankton veterans who fought in the Pacific as well. And we don't know for sure whether they actually had to take that island or not. MacArthur wanted to take it because he thought it would offer air support later on for the Japanese when he tried to retake the Philippines. Okay, Nimitz wasn't too excited about that whole affair, but it was a bloody, bloody affair. Then we had the Mariana Campaign, Peleliu, Saipan, Ujima, and Okinawa. I'll talk about those just briefly. The first campaign against the Japanese was in Guadalcanal, and that was 1942 to February 43. We suffered close to 6,000 casualties, the Japanese 24,000 casualties. This is where John F. Kennedy and PT-109 was cut in half in the slot. The USS South Dakota Battleship X made a name for itself. Joe Foss became the ace of aces, equaling Eddie Rickenbacker Stewart. 26 airplanes came back, got the Congressional Medal of Honor. But those numbers, while god awful, aren't even close to what they would become. Okay, so see if I can figure out how to run a computer here. All right. Tarawa, once again, was November 23, 1943. The Japanese suffered 5,000 killed in action. Only 17 Japanese soldiers surrendered or were captured alive. 17. 5,000 killed in action. We captured around 129 North Korean slave laborers, but that gives you an idea of the tenacity that was taking place. You're going to fight to the death. 17 out of 5,000 who were dead. Okay, no wounded. Just it's bizarre. Okay, and then Peldu. Okay, and this is where E.B. Sledge, sort of is his baptism of fire. And that's November of 1944. We had 10,076 U.S. casualties, Japanese 10,695 killed in action, 202 captured, but 10,625 killed in action. We captured a number of foreign laborers as well. Okay, and one of the things when you captured the Japanese soldiers, they had to literally strip them down to their undergarments because they would carry grenades or some type of means of injuring you even after they surrendered or were captured. Saipan, D-Day in the Pacific, written by Harold Goldberg, is a really good book on Saipan. Saipan was a Japanese possession, original possession. It's not something that they acquired through conquest. It was awarded to them after the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. It's actually a German colony that the Germans had to give up after the First World War. And there were numerous Japanese civilians living on Saipan. And as the U.S. approached Saipan, Tojo, who was the militaristic prime minister of Japan, gives a radio address, and he promises the people of Saipan, the civilians, that if they choose to fight against the Americans or not surrender to the Americans, that they would have the same status in heaven as the soldiers. Okay, this is a Shintoism belief. And you have to understand, once again, the context of the times. So these people, literally and figuratively, refused to surrender to the United States. And you have this massive cliff, and there's a memorial there today. You have between 7,000 and 8,000 civilians, whole families would join hands and jump off of this cliff. Americans tried to talk them out. It was actually footage, cameramen from the U.S. Army that were there filming women and, jumping off of this cliff because they felt that the Americans were absolutely barbaric, the white devils, if you will. There were 13,790 U.S. casualties, 3,426 killed in action on Saipan. The Japanese, of the 29,000 soldiers that were fighting, 24,000 were killed in action. Over 7,000 civilians were killed in action. The U.S. took Saipan. Tojo's government fell. He resigned ultimately, and later would be charged with war crimes after he tried to commit suicide. Didn't get the job done. He was later hanged for war crimes. Okay, all right. So the memorial there is quite touching. All right, the Battle of Leyte Gulf was fought in October 1944. This is when MacArthur returns. You don't really hear too much about the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The 32nd Division is my father's division, and there are a lot of guys from the Midwest here in the 32nd Division, from Freeman, Wagner, Wall, across South Dakota. And 645 days straight in combat, and I believe they were the last division to fight in World War II, to lay down their arms, actually. So here we go. Battle of Leyte Gulf. There were 16,043 soldiers and 7,270 sailors were killed. The Japanese suffered losses, incredible losses, over 250,000. Okay, you really don't hear too much about that. MacArthur had totally underestimated the Japanese resistance, and he got, a particular naval admiral got very lucky there too after taking a ruse, and we'll send the story for another day. But anyway, here we go. The kamikaze made its appearance there, and it's the divine wind. And the Japanese didn't have any trouble finding young, able Navy aviators to literally give up their life and fly a one-way mission. And if they flew the mission, and yes, they did have gas to return to where they were sent. They were a commodity that was in short supply, and they weren't going to waste them. So if a kamikaze went out and they couldn't make an attack, they flew back and landed. There's only one example of a kamikaze that came back 9 times, and the 9th time they executed for cowardice. But kamikaze attacks were really serious and became more serious the closer we get once again to the main islands. Okay, all right, and as a result of that, the USS South Dakota and the other warships all had to increase the anti-aircraft protection on those ships. Okay, on those ships, and Iwo Jima, right, 19 February to 26 March 1945. The U.S., we had 6,821 killed in action, 26,040 casualties. Japan, 18,375 killed in action or missing in action, 216 POWs. That was it. Okay, and that's the famous flag raising there in Mount Suriaki on 25th of February. And then Okinawa. Okinawa was Easter Sunday of 1945, the 1st of April 1945. And once again, Ken Hensler was on that particular landing. And this is going to be different, though. The Japanese did not choose to fight us on the beaches. They chose to let us come ashore peacefully, and they set up a defense in depth that we had to pay for every yard of territory that we took. And this was a combined U.S. Army and U.S. Marine engagement, okay? The landings were quiet, they had defense in depth, and this is the only battle in the Pacific, or campaign in the Pacific, where both commanding generals ended up dying. The U.S. General Commander Buckner went up to see the front, to see things for himself. In fact, they're filming it when a shell hit. He's killed. The Japanese commander sends a radio message to the Japanese that he apologizes for the defeat that they are going to encounter, and that he is going to give his life as an apology, and he commits suicide. Right there on the rocks overlooking the beach. So, the United States, during this campaign on Okinawa, we have 20,195 dead, 55,162 wounded in action. This is Japanese territory, okay? It's 500 kilometers from Kyushu in the home islands, all right? So once again, the closer we get, the more desperate the Japanese become and the harder they're fighting. The Japanese have estimates around 110,000 killed in action. Once again, it's the first time, though, that you actually see some Japanese civilians they're able to capture them without them killing themselves here at Okinawa. Okay, all right. So once again, the closer we get to Japan, we're going to set up bomber bases so that we can go in and bomb Japan. In fact, Iwo Jima, that's the main reason for that island, is so that the B-29 was an airplane that was originally, built for long missions like that, the most sophisticated bomber of the Second World War. And as they were fighting on Iwo Jima, there were actually B-29s that were crash landing there, and those crews were saved as well as the planes. Okay, we had started bombing Japan with these high-level bombers. The ceiling for the B-29 is something like 31,000 feet, completely pressurized cockpits, whereas the B-17s and the B-24 Liberators in the European theater, those guys would suit up to go up on their missions. They would put on long underwear, then they would put on their uniform, they would put on the sheepskin leather pants, and get it all. They touch the machines with their bare hands, their hands would freeze. Totally pressurized cockpits. I mean, these guys could go up in their shorts, in their khakis, and fly the missions. Okay, but remember the divine wind. Okay, that goes back to like 15th century stories where the invaders were blown off course, or their ships were destroyed from invading Japan by these winds. Okay, well, the winds were there. They were at different altitudes, and so when you're flying at high altitude, you drop the bomb load, and the winds would blow it all over the place. So our pinpoint precision bombing wasn't very precise. So enter General Curtis LeMay, who had served in the European theater. And in the European theater, the morale was really, really low. In fact, there were more airmen killed in the U.S. Army Air Corps fighting in the European theater than Marines died in the Pacific. I'm not mistaken. It's a crazy statistic or something like that. Anyway, they had to come up with a way to, increase the morale. So they came up with the idea that if you fly 25 missions, you get to go home. And the first plane to do it was the Memphis Belle. And ironically, Robert Morgan, who was the captain and flew the Memphis Belle, ended up transferring the Pacific after doing a bond tour of the United States. And this is a really good book, by the way. And so he ends up fighting with LeMay. All right, LeMay was in the Pacific, and they came across the idea that a lot of the planes were turning back and claiming that they had, you know, problems with the engines. They had, couldn't go with the mission. He felt that the guys just didn't want to, fly into Germany against Luftwaffe and the flak, and he was absolutely right. So he gets in the lead airplane and said, "I will fly in the lead airplane. I'm going to go on every mission with you. And anybody that turns around is going to be court-martialed." And suddenly the statistics went way down. Very few airplanes turned around. That's the type of guy he was. Cigar chomping, fire breather. And so he comes in, he takes over, and he decides that, okay, so what we're going to do. We're not going to fly those B-29s at 31,000 feet or 29,000 feet or even 20,000 feet. We're going to go down to 5,000 feet. We're going to take away the iron bombs, the 500 pounders, and we're going to replace them with incendiaries, magnesiums, and napalm. And so they went out and they started hitting cities. And if you have an opportunity, Robert McNamara, who later served as John F. Kennedy's Secretary of Defense and Lyndon Johnson's Secretary of Defense, a total 180 in Vietnam, wrote a book, and that's a great book, but we won't get into that today. But anyway, they did a film on that. It's called The Fog of War, okay? And it's a documentary, and it won the Academy Award. It's a great documentary. In that documentary, he goes back to his time serving under LeMay in the Pacific, and they go through all these Japanese cities that we firebombed. And we hit, Kokura, Yokohama, Suzuki, Tokyo on the 10th of March, 1945. More people died in the firebombing at Tokyo, which is considered to be conventional bombing, than died at Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Okay, and yet the Japanese did not surrender. Okay, so that's the point. In fact, Morgan writes about it in the book, right? And he was one of the last waves to come in, bombing Tokyo, and the guys in the plane were really nauseated because they could smell the burning flesh. The river running through Tokyo was boiling. That's how hot the water got from this firebomb. And you have to understand, the Japanese industry at the time wasn't like American industry. You didn't have these brick and steel buildings. Some of them did, but next to them you had wooden structures and sometimes paper, very, very flimsy built homes that were made out of dry wood and paper. And they would catch fire very quickly. And so the fires just spread and spread and spread and spread. And so in The Fog of War, they show these Japanese cities, and then they show an American city about equal size. And they would say, so much this city was destroyed, and it would give you really an idea, so it soaked in as to the damage that we were doing. And yet the Japanese did not surrender. Okay, there was no talk of surrender. In fact, once again, they wanted to fight this ultimate battle, the Ketsugo, so that they could get out of that unconditional surrender. Okay, all right. So it's June of 1945, and the bombing campaign is continuing to go. Okay, and they have to stop because they used up all the fire bombs. They were out of fire bombs. Okay, they had conventional bombs, but they're out of fire bombs. And so Truman's faced with four choices here in an attempt to war. Okay, so here's what happens. Okay, 12 April 1945. I'm getting ahead of myself here. FDR, who saw us through the Depression and saw us through World War II up until that time, who worked together with Winston Churchill to create an incredible alliance, and worked together with George C. Marshall, the architect of victory there in European theater, dies. Harry S. Truman was chosen to be FDR's last vice president. I had a chuckle because I think it was FDR's first vice president, saying that the job of vice president wasn't worth the bucket of warm spit, and that was Garner. But anyway, Wallace was the vice president at that time, and nobody wanted him because he was too liberal. So, and they knew that FDR wasn't doing well. But FDR wasn't thinking about dying. I mean, he's the president of the United States. He's thinking, I'm going to make it. He wasn't thinking about dying at all. But Wallace definitely wasn't going to be on the ticket with him. In fact, they always make a joke, if you want to get rid of the vice president, get him off the political background, send him to Siberia. And they literally sent him on a tour of Siberia, and they got him out of the country. And he comes back and he realizes he's off the ticket, and Truman's on. Truman had made a name for himself as a senator, as being an honest broker, and worked really, really hard in the U.S. Senate for the cause, if you will. In fact, he was in charge of making sure that U.S. manufacturers weren't making a lot of money, weren't making a killing. In fact, FDR said, once we started this arsenal of democracy, I didn't want one millionaire created. Truman made sure that wasn't happening. When suddenly he ran across this program that was soaking up millions and millions of dollars, and he kept researching it. Finally gets a knock at the door, and these gentlemen basically told him he will cease to look into this particular project that deals with national security of the highest order, etc. All right, so FDR passes away. Truman goes to the White House to see Mrs. Roosevelt and express his sympathies. He doesn't even get the words out. And gee, Harry, I feel sorry for you. The whole weight of the world is falling on your shoulders. She was absolutely right. In fact, Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War, comes in. He wants to have a word with Truman, but then backs off. He wants to tell him about the atomic bomb, this weapon that they have, and what's taking place here, but he backs off. And then he writes him a memo. Hey, I remember I tried to talk to you. I really need to see you. This is like, I think it's 24 April. And he finally gets in and explains that we got this bomb that we're working on, and this bomb is really tremendous. But once again, nobody thought that the bomb was going to end the war. In fact, they had totally mispredicted what this bomb would actually cost. There were certain generals within the establishment that thought, Marshall included, thought they might use it for not necessarily a strategic, but a tactical sense. In other words, that they could use it to bomb the beaches, and then the soldiers come in right after that. So radiation didn't figure into the picture at all. Not whatsoever. Okay, they thought the bright light, they could use that, but they didn't quite grasp the radiation, didn't get the power of the bomb. 18,000 tons of TNT. Small in comparison to what we have today, by the way. And at the Nagasaki and Hiroshima memorials, the Japanese are trying to get it across to us in the world that, maybe we shouldn't have backed out of the INF Treaty. And that nuclear proliferation is something we still should be concerned about. I know we're dealing with the COVID virus. It's the first time I've been in a building had a mask up in a long time. It's the first time I've been able to teach in quite a while. And it feels pretty good. Wish there were more people here, but anyway, I'm getting off track and I'm getting emotional here. Here we go. So here's the deal. They have this bomb, right? It's simply a theory yet. They haven't tried it out. They're going to test it. Truman knows about it. Truman's got a lot in his mind, and he makes some changes, if you will, keeps the same cabinet members, with the exception of Secretary of State. Burns is going to be the new Secretary of State. And he heads over now for the Potsdam Conference, right? Germany surrenders. Hitler kills himself on the 30th of April, and Karl Donitz is now the leader of Germany, and they surrender 7 May, and 8 May is known as VE Day. All right, so Truman heads over, and he's going to sit down and talk with Stalin, okay? And originally, he didn't have any misgivings about Stalin, thought actually he could deal with Joseph Stalin. And Churchill had just been defeated in an election in Britain, which is, kids don't get that. How could Churchill, this guy who led them, this charismatic leader who led them through the war, be defeated? Well, the British people wanted national health care. And Clement Attlee promised them national health care. And Churchill's defeated, Attlee's in. Churchill came over for the first week or so. And then Attlee comes in. But Churchill had an agenda that was set up. And anyway, they talk about division of Germany, division in Europe again. It was just Yalta. And they also talk about reparations. The Russians are really interested in reparations. I mean, the Russians had fought more German divisions than the United States and Britain had fought. There's been the cream of the German army in the Wehrmacht, the SS as well. And Truman actually toured then some of the areas dealing with the Holocaust. And he was very moved by that. And I just will put it at this point. Consider using chemical weapons as a resort in the Pacific. Number one, the Japanese had used chemical weapons in China. I believe they're the only power to use chemical weapons, but the Germans using them in us, the concentration camps. But they had done some really horrible things in China and were still killing hundreds of thousands of people per month. That's what people don't understand the context of the times once again. The Japanese were in Manchuria, they were in China, Burma, they were killing thousands of people per month, were dying from slave labor, from abuse, simply being murdered, okay? So the war had to end. Save American lives, save those lives, and save Japanese lives. All right, so Truman's visiting with Stalin, and he wants a couple things. First of all, he wants Stalin to enter into the war in the Pacific, take some of the weight off of our shoulders, because it's pretty much a U.S. thing. I mean, the Brits were fighting in Burma and India, but the rest of it was pretty much an American show. Remember Admiral King? All right, so anyway, he got Stalin said, yes, once things get straightened out here, I'll enter into the war, so on. And he also said, well, I need to talk to you alone. And he told him, we have this bomb. I mean, it's a new bomb, and just one bomb can destroy an entire city. And Stalin tried to be surprised, like he didn't know anything about it. He already knew about it through espionage. See, while he was there, Truman got the code word that the test at Trinity had actually been successful. So he felt it was an ace, up his sleeve, that he had this bomb. And Stalin looked at him and said, use it. And Truman said, okay, that was sort of a downer. I thought I'd get a little bit more out of Uncle Joe than that. And he goes and writes a letter, but at that time he had no misconceptions about Truman. He wrote to his sister that Truman is a real SOB. So, his perception of Stalin had changed very, very quickly. Nothing to do with his reaction. Other things. All right. So Truman comes back from that particular meeting, and they issue the Potsdam Declaration. And the Potsdam Declaration, important declaration, basically calling upon Japan to surrender, and if they don't surrender, they're going to be meeting, ultimate destruction. Okay, so Potsdam's over, Truman's back, and he looks back at the report, right? Already in June, he was very concerned about ending the war now in the Pacific, the number of casualties that were coming in. Not just numbers. And, the United States has been at war now for quite some time, not as long as the European countries, but I think having gone through Berlin and seen what Berlin looked like, and Cologne, other cities as well, had an impact. And he called in former President Hoover and asked him to form a commission to look into this to see how he and the people in his team felt we could end the war. And ultimately, the Hoover Commission, which you can get online, he suggests the president, hey, get away from this unconditional surrender. If you have to, negotiate, end the war, save American lives. It's not worth more American lives. We have to think about the future. And I think that, honestly, obviously had an impact on Truman as well. So Truman had basically four choices at this point, right? Invade, that would be Operation Olympic. And, there's a big debate. Should Nimitz be the commander for Olympic, the invasion of Japan, or MacArthur? My first name is Douglas. My father was in the 32nd Infantry. My father was called up, given extra bandoliers of ammunition along with two other guys, and they thought, well, that usually meant they were going into the difficult situation. And ultimately, what ends up happening is that they were to be the snipers, bodyguards, whatever, for MacArthur. So that was his general, so I'm named after him. His opinion changed after he read American Caesar. Never mind. All right, so Operation Olympic, the invasion of the home island of Kyushu, and MacArthur got the nod. He was going to be the commander of that. So he's preparing for the invasion of Kyushu. Okay? All right. Bomb and blockade. Okay, they're continuing to bomb and blockade. The Japanese Navy was no more of a threat. U.S. submarines had already sank 54% of Japanese shipping. They had an aircraft carrier left, I think 2 battleships, but the aircraft carrier itself was damaged. Right, the submariners did one heck of a job, and their main goal right now is laying off of the Japanese islands, doing reconnaissance, and also picking up U.S. flyers, like former President George Herbert Walker Bush, who was flying an SBD, shot down over Chichijima. His rear didn't make it, but he did. And there's a great book called Flyboys, fascinating story. It also discusses the barbarity of the Japanese, who actually cannibalized some American flyers on Chichijima. 3, they could warn or demonstrate the bomb. Okay, so 1, Operation Olympic. 2, bomb and blockade, continue doing what we're doing, which wasn't working. 3, demonstrate the bomb. That wasn't going to work. We're going to say, all right, hey guys, we're going to go over here. We're going to blow up the island of Chuchi over here tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. Get everybody off it. We'll show the immense power of this bomb. Well, you have to understand, the Japanese knew that we were ultimately going to invade the home islands. So the Japanese Air Force, which, the Naval Air Force was thrashed at the Mariana Turkey Shoot. These are all rookie pilots, but many of the cream of the crop, they kept back on the home islands. They had over 10,000 aircraft, and they were serviceable. They were not on airfields. They were camouflaged. They were off the road, out in the country, away from our reconnaissance flights. My father was also on occupation duty. So he went down into the tunnels and saw the massive amount of ammunition and armaments that they had stored up at Kyushu. They also saw the airplanes, along with the 5,000 to 10,000 kamikazes. They had 5,000 on Kyushu, another 5,500 kamikazes ready to go on Honshu. Okay, so they were ready for us. Okay, so demonstrating the bomb, we'd found a B-29 over there. They would have sent everything they had up to shoot that plane down. Or let's say we didn't demonstrate the bomb. How many bombs do we actually have in our arsenal? We had one more. Yeah, we had a bomb for Hiroshima, we had the bomb for Nagasaki, and one more that's supposed to be done by September, and a couple more by December. Okay, all right. So listen, most of the guys that were working with Marshall, within the Joint Chiefs, felt that it was going to take at least 5 bombs before the Japanese would surrender. So we were ultimately going to have to invade, and maybe use the bombs as a means to an end there as well. They didn't know the Japanese would ultimately give up after the second bomb. Okay, so demonstrate a bomb, that's not an option. All right, or drop the bomb on a major city. They'd already been planning on that feature in the summer, actually in the spring. Now, it's interestingly enough, Nagasaki was not on the list until the day, I think, day before the mission, or it might even been the morning of the mission. It got tagged on as an alternate target. The weather over Japan at that particular time of year, the winds are strong, and there are clouds that form, and they just move in at a moment's notice, and they could not use radar to detonate this bomb. The bomb was not detonated on the ground. It was detonated at an altitude around 1,800 feet, and they had to be able to visually see where they were dropping it. And at Nagasaki, the accuracy wasn't where it was supposed to be, but that's neither here nor there, I guess, in this moment. All right, so Operation Downfall, Operation Olympic, Operation Cornet was the proposed invasion of Japan, the main islands. Kyushu, and then that's Operation Olympic. Operation Downfall is downfall of Japan. All right, so Operation Olympic is the invasion of Kyushu, okay, southernmost island. All right, well, the Japanese are looking at this. They're trying to figure out where we're going to land. They pull out a map. They said they're going to land at Kyushu. It's the only logical place. I mean, look at Japan. They've got some coastline and it's got mountains, okay? There's only a few places where you can land, right? Now, it's not like D-Day, okay? It's not like D-Day. D-Day, U.S. and British and Canadian troops, right? Loaded up. They went across the channel, okay? Not to Calais. That's where Hitler thought they were going to go. So he had Operation Fortitude, was a disinformation campaign that led Hitler to believe that we were going to land in Norway or at Calais. He kept the 15th Army back for 3 weeks, thinking that we still were going to land at Calais, thinking that the invasion at Normandy was just a feint. You know, Patton finally comes over, and then he realizes that Dr. Lieber Buses Los, this is not the correct, you know, it's too late. But there was no disinformation campaign that was going to lead the Japanese to believe that we were going to land any place but Kyushu. Once we were going to aim for Tokyo, that was Operation Cornet, they had a disinformation campaign that they felt they would use in an attempt to make the Japanese feel that we were going to land in Korea. Okay, and they actually brought some Koreans over. They had dissidents that crossed over from China into Korea, sending radio messages back. So that was working for us. But Kyushu, they had it pegged, right? And this is the problem, right? General Marshall felt that time was crucial here. If we really had to go through this invasion, time was crucial. And the amount of troops that were being moved to Kyushu were absolutely incredible. Okay, so the situation, right? They had 80,000 troops there, early or late 1944. Right, June 1945, they had 300,000 troops. Right now, listen, some of these were new recruits. They were constantly rebuilding their army, but you have to understand they also had hardcore veterans that they brought back from Manchuria. They brought back from other places. This is the home island. They were going to put up one hell of a fight, okay? All right. By August, 900,000 troops and 28 million people living on Kyushu who were trained by the local entities. The women were trained how to use weapons that they had, even sticks, pitchforks. Children in grade school were taught how to throw themselves under a Sherman tank. You take a look at our tank losses in Okinawa and how they did it, and you'll understand. Okay, they were not afraid. This was a suicide mentality. Even the Japanese who were interviewed living today talked about the suicide mentality. The emperor boasted about the 130 million fiery bullets. These were fiery bullets were the Japanese people who were going to give their lives to stop this American invasion. So, right, D-Day, right? You got 5 beaches, right? You got the Americans at Omaha really caught heck, but this is going to be different, right? At D-Day, the Luftwaffe flew a few sorties. Right here, you've got literally and figuratively 5,000 kamikazes. Okay, when they flew at Leyte, 1 in 6 hit a target. Okinawa was 1 in 9, but the damage they did was absolutely incredible. Okay, and now you have a target-rich environment. They weren't going to go for the battleships. They weren't going to go for the carriers. They weren't going to go for the destroyers. They're going to go for the troop transports. Not only did they have the kamikazes, right? They had thousands of speedboats, specially built. Had a diesel engine in the back, one guy driving it, went about 45, 50 miles an hour, 600-pound explosives there, about 600 pounds of explosive in the nose, and 2 rocket launchers. They could shoot the anti-ship rockets first and then slam them in. So they had thousands of those ready to go. They also had thousands of frogmen that went out, sat on the bottom for 10 hours with a long pole with a mine on the end of it, or they also had an explosive vest. They would wait for the troop transport, an amphibious landing craft to come in, and they would blow those up. Okay. They also had chitin. Now, chitin had been used successfully. In fact, USS Indianapolis, who brought the first bomb over to Tinian, was destroyed by a Japanese submarine. Okay. The Japanese sub-commander, his second in command, called the chitin. The chitin was a kamikaze torpedo rider. They would ride a torpedo into a ship. He didn't use the chitin. They had thousands of chitin ready to go here as well. Chitin could be launched from ships. They could also be launched from shore to destroy American shipping, right? So you have kamikaze airplanes. You got the frogmen, right? You got the chitin. You got the speedboats. This is what the Americans faced. Right? Imagine this, right? You have Americans that get wounded, right? They need blood, they need plasma. You had 3 American Medical Corps ships that were carrying blood and plasma. If one of those ships went down, you had a lot of wounded American boys that were not going to get blood or plasma and were going to die as a result. This is what Americans faced with the invasion of Kyushu. Okay? So they started to think their way through it. General Marshall was sort of scratching. Admiral King said, "This is not going to work." He asked Nimitz, "What do you think, Chester? Should we do this?" Nimitz said, "No, I don't believe it." The only person that really was thinking that this is a good deal and that there's no problem with this was MacArthur, the guy who was going to lead it and get his name in the history books. Yeah. Anyway, Truman was absolutely horrified by the casualty statistics. The Hoover Commission, 1 million casualties. U.S. casualties. 1 million. And Marshall asked MacArthur to go through and see if he can revise those casualty numbers. So MacArthur comes up with an interesting method here. He wasn't going to have hard numbers. You're going to use ratios, right? So the kill ratio on Saipan was 1 to 6. The kill ratio on Okinawa was we killed 1. For every American soldier was lost, we killed 10 Japanese. On Saipan, once again, for every Japanese soldier, American soldier was killed, we killed 6 or 7 Japanese soldiers. Okay, so he started using ratios. This doesn't really tell anybody anything. It was a way to cover up what was actually most likely going to happen. And by the way, when it came to figuring out what casualties, they got pretty darn good at it by this time. So, Operation Olympic, the Japanese now, they wanted one bloody battle called the Ketsu-go, and that's what they were determined to get. If they got that, they felt that the Americans then would allow them to negotiate rather than to accept unconditional surrender. Okay, now, we have the radio traffic. This is what the the critics or the revisionists are saying that the Japanese were, ready to surrender. You had a diplomat was attempting to contact the Soviet Union in an attempt to, make a peace deal with the Soviet Union. Well, this diplomat didn't have any way, shape, or form of influencing the the committee or the emperor or anybody in power or prime minister. Okay, so yeah, well, somebody might have been interested in peace. They had no way of bringing that about. Okay, all right. They did contact the Russians. The Russians invaded Manchuria. The Russians invaded with close to 2 million troops. And the Japanese forces were absolutely thrashed by the Russian blitzkrieg. All right, their attack aircraft, the T-34s, T-85s at this time, the Joseph Stalin ones, they just absolutely rolled over the Japanese accent. Right, so the revisionists or critics are going to argue that by this time, U.S.-Soviet relations had soured, and one of the reasons why we were going to use the bomb was to, influence what would become obviously Cold War, the Russians, trying to put them in their place and let them understand that we are going to make policy here, and that you have to understand, we're number one, blah blah blah. I don't think that was the ultimate goal here. I really believe the ultimate goal was an attempt to end the war. Okay, and once again, they didn't believe that one bomb or two bombs were going to do it. And all right, so but the invasion, that was not a good thing. Okay, well, how are they going to get the manpower for the invasion? All right, well, they're going to use all the manpower that they had in the Pacific at this time. All right, they were drafting guys in their 40s with kids. All right, troops that were returning from Europe. The war is over. They're all excited. Remember Times Square picture? They were told, many of them, that on their return, 500,000, you're going to return to the United States, and you're going to go to training, and then you're going to be sent over to Japan for the invasion. There were mutinies on board the returning troop ships. 400,000 of those troops, they weren't brought back to the United States for training. They were sent directly over the Pacific. They were not happy. They'd already fought their war. So they gave the word to go. And once again, George Marshall said, time is not on our side. The longer we give the Japanese, the more men, their material, they're going to be able to put in our way, and the casualties and figures will just get worse. So they gave the word to go. Okay, and the United States had trained a particular group of B-29 pilots, and Paul Tibbets was going to be, he was the commander of the Enola Gay. Now, remember, the bomb, is the Manhattan Project, which they kept secret except from the Russians. Don't know how they found out. But it was a joint British and American project, and I think people forget about that. In fact, the B-29 bomb release wasn't working. Right? These babies, they weigh close to 10,000 pounds. The only other airplane that could lift that bomb load, B-17 couldn't. In fact, the B-17 could not carry the bomb load and did not have the distance of the B-24 Liberator. But the B-24 Liberator, you look at it, looks like a box with wings. It's really ugly. I mean, its wings, you could see it moving when it flew. It just wasn't a glamorous airplane, but the B-17 was a beautiful plane, streamlined. So when the press covered the war in the European theater, they always covered the B-17s. Those poor guys like McGovern who flew the B-24s, they were sort of, they didn't get much press at all. But neither of those airplanes, the B-24, B-17 for sure couldn't. The B-17's bomb load was about equal to the HE-111. I mean, it's not really that great bomb load. We just had a lot of them with a lot of 50 caliber machine guns. It was a great plane, took a lot of damage. It was easy to fly. Great plane, right? But it could not carry this bomb load. Nor could the B-24, which could carry a larger bomb load and could go a longer distance. But the British Lancaster could. British Lancaster 4-engine bomber could carry the Dam Buster, and it had a bomb release that would work. So the British actually had a group of Lancasters painted all black, and they were training that if the B-29s couldn't do the job, the Lancasters were going to do it. So ultimately, we fixed the bomb trigger release. And during the Marianas campaign, we captured Tinian, and that was it's still there. Bob Winter actually had a friend of his send him photographs of the pit that was used on the runway to load the bomb onto, first of all, Enola Gay and then Boxcar. It's still there. But I don't know if anybody can travel to the Pacific, the Marianas, the Titanium, to get a picture of it. But I have a picture of it, but I lost it when we got hacked and also those photos. But anyway, it's still there. All right, so they load up the bomb and they are heading over. They have one airplane that's going to be taking photographs and targets Hiroshima. Not Hiroshima, Hiroshima. And the clock stopped exactly when the bomb hit. And today at the city center, obviously, you have the Peace Memorial. And 8:15, it goes off. It's 1,800 feet and it explodes. Okay. At first, estimates around 80,000 people were instantly destroyed. Estimates are higher now in regards to that. But once again, the radiation, we didn't know about the radiation. That was 6 August. Everything went perfect. The airplane, takeoff, everything was great. Okay? And then nothing happens. Then I was surrendered. Truman ordered that there would be no more bombing campaigns. We'll see how they react. In fact, I skipped something. Truman actually had warned the Japanese that if you should surrender. If you don't, you're going to face utter destruction, etc. Okay, and they actually dropped leaflets saying to the Japanese people, "Get out of the major cities. You know where the industry is taking place. Get away from those places because we're going to really hit them hard." And they should have taken us seriously, especially after we firebombed them all. Right? All right. So 2 days later, it's 9 August, and we're going to go after. Let's see. We went up the original target. And I believe it was clouded over, and they added Nagasaki to the target list that day. And the bombardier's birthday was that day, and I don't know, there's a lot of stories to go with it. Anyway, they got over it, and he could actually see it. The only other thing that they could have done was actually drop the bomb in the China Sea and then ditch the aircraft, because they were running low on gas. So how many atomic bombs? We had only one left at that time. So they got a glimpse of Nagasaki through the clouds. The Enola Gay, by the way, was flying camera cover at that. So Tibbets was there. Tibbets was actually Eisenhower's pilot prior to that, and the plane that Tibbets flew, Eisenhower in, is actually at Ellsworth Air Force Base. It was a B-25. It's at the museum out there. Anyway, they dropped the bomb. It's about 11:15, and it goes off, and it hit in a residential area. Okay, but on the outside of ground zero were industrial areas. Okay, and so that wasn't a well-known fact until later on either. So one of the things, the ancient capital of Kyoto was avoided. Henry Stimson had honeymoon there. That's the story. But I think more relevance is that he realized that after the war, we were going to need the Japanese to, we learned from Versailles. You don't rub their noses in it. And after the war, we wanted them to not be angry with us. We wanted at some point for them to like us. We'd help them rebuild. But if we destroyed their capital city, Tokyo, or their ancient capital, that wasn't going to happen. We destroyed everything of a military value in Tokyo, but the emperor's palace and the grounds, everything was untouched. In Yokohama, we destroyed all the buildings, but not the hospital. My dad ended up in that hospital. Okay. In fact, prior to this, when the bomb was dropped in Hiroshima, he was on Luzon fighting against Yamashita. He was in the hospital there, field hospital, and the guys were told that one bomb had destroyed the entire city. So these guys are laying in bed, and they're trying to figure out how big the bomber must have been and how big the bomb was. They were talking about something enormous. They had no idea that it was a B-29. I thought it was supposed to be much larger. So the bomb goes off at Nagasaki. The emperor now is faced with a divided cabinet as to what they should do. The warmongers wanted to continue. They wanted the Ketsu go. They wanted to maintain power, but he ultimately broke the tie. I see the time. He ultimately broke the tie and decided to agree with the Potsdam Conference. He didn't say surrender. He didn't say the war was. He just said the war was over in his radio address. In fact, the Japanese people had never heard his voice before. This is the first time that he spoke from the radio. And not using the words surrender or lost, just that the war was over. And prior to doing that, there was a palace coup. And the coup was led by a number of generals and officers who wanted to continue the war and get that final battle. The officers were, the coup was put down, but I don't think a lot of people realize that. So once again, this idea that Japan was ready to surrender and willing to surrender prior to this, that's inaccurate. Right? Going back to my original premise. And I wish people that would take a little bit better look at that and understand that the decision that was made and the traditionalist view is pretty accurate. Yes, I think there were some sentiments in regards to the what ultimately be referred to as the Cold War. But when you take a look at the number of casualties that would have obviously occurred had we invaded at Kyushu and then later at the plains outside Tokyo, When the war ended, we avoided those casualties. We avoided the Japanese casualties. The Japanese then stopped killing the innocent people and civilians in Burma, in Manchuria, in China. Okay, that stopped. In fact, there's a really good article. It's why Truman dropped the bomb from August 8th, 2005. It's 60 years after Hiroshima. We now have the secret intercepts that shaped his decision. And this is written by Richard B. Frank. It's a really good article. And it's based on two books. One of the books is The Most Controversial Decision by Scamble, and the other one is by Richard B. Frank, the author of this article. Okay, and he goes into detail in regards to the number of innocent people that the Japanese had been using as slave labor and were dying monthly. And it's absolutely shocking, the number of people that were dying. Hundreds of thousands of people needlessly dying as a result of the occupation and the horrific treatment by the Japanese. So ultimately then the decision is made 10th of August, and the 14th of August the emperor talks to the people. On the 2nd of September the peace agreement then was signed aboard the USS Missouri, not the USS South Dakota, which had the most battle stars of any battleship in the U.S. Navy at the time, more than the USS Iowa, I might add. Anyway, I'll also point out to you that the idea of dropping a third atomic bomb was discussed, and that was a sense of urgency. That bomb was supposed to be ready in September. They had moved that up to possibly dropping another atomic bomb on the 24th of August. It was on its way to Tinian, and Truman really didn't want to use it, and he didn't have to. I wish I had more time. I wish I had you here so we could have a little discussion. But I thank the library for offering this opportunity for me. And the rest of you, God bless, stay healthy, and stay safe. Thank you.